Hey class, Professor Ramey, and today's lecture we are going to be expanding on what the textbook talked about with the civil rights movements, particularly the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, and then move on into how the African American civil rights movement blossomed into the women's movement and into the Hispanic movement, and particularly in the 70s. And then we're going to ask ourselves, and it's one of the essay options, what is the legacy of this and how does this affect us today? Is the civil rights movement still going on today? And leave the issue there. The textbook does a fairly good job of going through the events in chapters 29 and 30. I think it makes a crucial error in the fact that there's no chapter itself devoted to the civil rights movement. It's subsections of two different chapters. They broke it into the 50s and 60s, which is reasonable, because the civil rights movement in the 50s was much different than the one in the 60s. But I think a chapter in itself on a movement that's so substantial and important in American history and affects us still today, to not dedicate an entire chapter to it is interesting to say the least. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to merge that together, and in many ways we're just going to try to simplify the civil rights movement. It's actually not too difficult to understand if we remove some preconceptions about it and just keep things as simple as possible. When you break down the civil rights movement, probably the first thing that comes to your mind, you think of Martin Luther King. Maybe you think of Rosa Parks. Maybe you think of Malcolm X, right? Medgar Evers. Each of these leaders, each of these members of the civil rights movement was different in their own way. And yet, if you actually break it down and you get to what each was saying in their different way and with their different perspective and their different ideas, they weren't asking for anything new. They weren't demanding the U.S. government did anything new. Really what they were demanding was that the U.S. government, and to some extent, or maybe to a large extent, depending on the perspective, the American people start actively enforcing and living up to the laws that were already on the books. Not new legislation, though much was passed, not new programs, just enforce what was already there. And largely what that meant is the full enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were being violated, skirted, ignored, or just not enforced by the U.S. overall. From a large period since the time of their inception in the 1860s and 70s up until the 1960s, and perhaps you can make a case continuing on after that, maybe even up to the present day, depending on your perspective. So what we're going to do is we're going to step back in time a little bit, go back to the very beginning of this class, and then we're going to project that forward into the civil rights movements. So let's talk about these two amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendments. These two amendments were part of a group of three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that we call the Reconstruction Amendments. They were crafted during the Reconstruction era of the United States after the Civil War to rebuild the United States, make it whole once again, but to also give free African slaves some chance, some modicum of citizenship and a chance in American society. The Radical Republicans in particular, going back to your 1301 class if you've had it, were really interested in saying, okay, you're a slave, and all of a sudden you're free, and that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm free, except what you got. You got a job? Nope. Got any money? Nope. Education? Nope. You don't even have a place to live. Okay, what can we do to incorporate African Americans into American society and to give a chance? And there was, you think back, the further back you go, you say the more racist people were. That's not really the case, actually. We're going to get into the nuance of culture in this a little bit later, but the Radical Republicans, many people in the American Senate and House of Representatives, particularly of this extreme, I guess, branch of the Republican Party, actually sought integration and for African Americans to have participation in government and in the United States. And so they set up three amendments. Now, the 13th Amendment, technically crafted in 1863, enforced in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, ended slavery. In a larger discussion, we would talk about how the 13th Amendment was violated with institutions like sharecropping and all that. Let's leave that out of the conversation today. Let's focus on the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, you can probably see it up on the board back here, guarantee two things. First off, if you were born or naturalized in the United States, regardless of race, gender, or anything. You are a citizen of the United States. This was largely done to overturn a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott decision, which basically said if you were not white, you were not a citizen. So citizenship to all that are born and naturalized. But the second part of the 14th Amendment, and in many ways the more powerful, and you can argue that the 14th Amendment might be the second most powerful amendment in our Constitution. The second part says, if you are a citizen of the United States, you are guaranteed equal protection of the laws. In other words, the law cannot look at you differently. You know, justice is blind, you are a citizen, these are the laws, and they apply to everybody equally. The 15th Amendment, right, very simple amendment, right, basically said if you're a citizen of the United States and male and you reach your state's age limit, right, which varied back then, today it's 18, you could vote. So basically, the simplest thing, all males, citizens of the United States, have the right to vote. Sorry, ladies, you read about it. It was 1920 for y'all. So there you go. The 14th and the 15th Amendments say, okay, first off, free slaves, African Americans in the United States are citizens, and you can vote, right? To incorporate, to integrate, and to, you know, include all the full privileges of being an American. So what happened to these? Why was there a civil rights movement 100 years later then? Well, because they weren't enforced. Reconstruction ended in 1877, the U.S. government removed all support for these amendments, and things went back to the same, right? Without getting into a much larger discussion, we usually do in a face-to-face class about the origins of racism and the origins of, and how slavery related to racism. Just understand that 200 years of culture going back to the 1600s and the origin of the slave system that started using Africans as slaves probably by the 1640s and 50s, based on, not on racism, but based on a bunch of other factors, used a justification though. Well, why were blacks the slaves? So, you know, in 1760, right, or 1840, a little young boy or girl said, Mommy, Daddy, why are black slaves and whites free? What became the justification for that slave system was, well, blacks are inferior. Blacks are not equal to whites. That culture that developed, that permeated, not just the U.S. South where the slavery was legal, but even into the North where racism took on a different tone, because as a tone of almost of an alien proportion, because there weren't that many blacks in the North, right? But these ideas permeated throughout the United States and to some extent the Western Hemisphere all through, that blacks were not equal to whites, and it developed for 200 years. And for roughly a decade during radical Reconstruction, when there was an attempt to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, there was some change made, but 10 years isn't enough to change 200 years of culture. And so in 1877 and later, when the United States government basically just steps back and says, we're not going to enforce these two keystone elements of our Constitution, well, what do you think happens? So in 1896, we have a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that separate facilities, in other words, segregation, to separate people based on race, that was okay. As long as the separate facilities were equal, that's okay, you can do that. Well, there's two problems with this. The first problem is the pure bullshit of it, right? You don't separate people if you say they are equal, right? What's the only reason you separate things? Because there's a difference between those things, right? And what did the separation on this hinge when we're talking about race relations? It hinges on a very simple thing. It was separated based on the fact that whites were superior, blacks were inferior, and that's what our segregation, that's what our separation is going to be. So if you take that as the truth, then what do you think about these facilities? Were they ever going to be equal? Of course not. And so as soon as the Supreme Court decision came down in Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Blacks went to black schools, whites went to white schools. There was black hospitals and white hospitals. Black parks, black public parks, white public parks, and sections on. Black swimming areas, white swimming areas, right? Even this moved into the private sector, where waiting rooms and dining rooms and restaurants would be white only. Water fountains. If you go do a simple Google image search and just type segregation, right? And you can take a look at these images. I mean, water fountains, it would say colored, right? And white. And then actually take a look at these water fountains. It's the ridiculousness of it. knew no bounds, as cooling rods would be placed in white water fountains and black water fountains, would come off sometimes off the runoff. It is ridiculous. And it was to reinforce an idea that you are a second-class citizen, that you are not guaranteed the citizenship of the 14th Amendment. And when the U.S. government basically said that was okay, nothing tried to change the culture. Now, what about the 15th Amendment? If you're African American, you're guaranteed the right to vote. Well, if you were a male, and then after 1920, regardless of gender. What happened? Well, Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy test, grandfather clauses, right? And we don't have to run down each and every one of these, but basically excluded African Americans from the vote. And if that wasn't enough, well, you went to vote, what would you see out in front of your house at 3 o'clock in the morning? A burning cross and a bunch of people in white robes and hoods is the KKK and white supremacy groups. And the reality is, after the removal of government enforcement, right, African Americans were placed much in the same position they were in as when they were slaves. And so you fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, right? And the reason for Martin Luther King, and the reason for Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the reason for Malcolm X, right, is nothing new. It was to enforce what was already there. The only thing that had really changed was World War II had happened. In World War II, there was an expectation of equality that was starting to grow. If you were good enough as an African American to go fight overseas and die for this country, or stay home and to do the work and build the war machines and to help participate and give money to the U.S. government for the United States to win the war, there was an expectation of equality. There was an expectation of rights. And we'll see this relates to the women's movement, the Hispanic movement as well. And so during World War II and immediately after, we're going to see a push as African Americans are pushing for equality, right? The armed forces desegregate in 1948. Up until that time, there were white units and black units. They integrated. Maybe a name some of y'all heard of, Jackie Robinson, the first African American to play Major League Baseball. It seems like sports, so a big deal. Well, it was a huge deal. Baseball was America's pastime. This is symbolic of the fact that, if America's pastime in sport was integrating, maybe this is possible overall. And then, of course, leads into where your textbook picks up things like in 1953, Brown versus the Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that separate facilities are inherently, or by their very nature, unequal, and therefore segregation has to end, starting in public schooling, but then it moves on into integration in public places all across the United States. No more segregation, no more separation, to integrate American society. And as you can imagine, culture hadn't changed much, and this is going to lead to a backlash, right? And this is where you start in the episodic. If you read through the chapters, you can read about the Montgomery bus boycott, all 3 sentences of it, which is a little bit unfortunate in there, but nonetheless, the textbook does a pretty good job of going through these episodes of the Civil Rights Movement. Sometimes it tells the story wrong. It makes Rosa Parks out to be a victim. Rosa Parks was not a victim. Rosa Parks was a fighter. She was a warrior pushing for change. And it brings up Martin Luther King. And I guess in essence, the main thing I want you to understand about the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s is, although it was slow, there was a positive push. It was slow though. But there was some legislation, although Eisenhower largely remained silent on a lot of these issues and did not get involved as the president, right? You see a slow and steady push. But as that push became larger and larger to integrate, when you get to the late 50s and into the early 60s, there's a backlash in politics and a backlash at the local level. And so the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s takes on a much different tenor or tone than that of the 50s. It is more violent, it is more militant, it is more extreme, right? We see starting in 1960, the Freedom Riders, right? As buses were, a bus of of college students, in particular, but civil rights activists, making a kind of symbolic bus ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans and integrating bus terminals, things like that. It was bombed, right? Then the Freedom Riders themselves were beaten. We see at Ole Miss University, right, when James Meredith, an African-American veteran of the armed forces, enrolls to go to college there, gets federal orders saying, yes, James Meredith is going to go to the University of Mississippi, to Ole Miss, right? He is met by a mob in front of the registration building, and there's a shootout occurs between federal marshals and this mob, right? And 23,000 troops are sent to escort James Meredith through his college classes. Keep in mind the population, or the student population of Ole Miss at this time was 8,000. So there's basically nearly 3 soldiers to every student on that campus, right? And we see this violence grow. We see the Selma demonstrations. They made a movie about this. I'm not sure if anybody's seen it. If not, I haven't seen it myself, but I want to check it out. As African Americans and whites that were participating in the civil rights movement were marching from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama to register to vote, and they were tear gassed and beaten by the police, right? And this is how deep ingrained this culture of racism developed. And this wasn't just in the South, although predominantly most of the violence was seen in the South, right? I don't really want to talk about the video. It's pretty horrific, but if you have never heard of the Emmett Till murder, you might do yourself a favor and check it out and see how deep-seated this was. But this extended all over the United States as well. We see demonstrations and riots in the Watts area of Los Angeles. In Newark, New Jersey, there are riots and there are protests and there's violence. In Detroit, the 4th largest riot in the history of the United States took place. It was and the civil rights movement was taking over. But what started happening, particularly as you get into 1963 and 64, is a lot of African Americans started backing away or lost faith in Martin Luther King's message, right? Not all, but maybe not even most, but quite a lot. And we're going to see a much different civil rights movement develop in the 60s, right? And I'm trying to explain this as simply as possible. We're talking about complex issues, and we're also talking about how everybody's perspective is a little different, so we have to talk in generalities. But what was happening a lot with Martin Luther King's message, and I don't think I have to explain that too much. I have a dream, right? Martin Luther King's message that we can all come together, we can all integrate, we can hold hands and, sing Kumbaya and dance in circles. And it seems so pleasant and as a reality. And there's a lot to love about Martin Luther King's message, right? It's so easy to take. It sounds great, right? Except it wasn't working. The nonviolence, the turn your other cheek if you're hit, that idea, it didn't seem to be coming to fruition as the civil rights movement was blocked time and time again, even with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, right? What did the U.S. government say as soon as the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64? Well, the civil rights movement's over. Except it wasn't, right? And so what starts to change is many African American leaders are going to have a new message in the 60s, right? And we kind of collect these together into this idea of black power. And a simplistic, and it is simplistic, explanation of the black power movement is something along the lines like this, right? The rejection of some ideas of Martin Luther King. And I'll use an analogy here. Martin Luther King, in this analogy, it'd be knocking at the door and saying, hey guys, can we come in? We want to join your group. Can you let us in? We want to be part of you, right? It was seen as weak. The Black Power movement was based on this idea that, hey, being black is good. Black is beautiful. Black is strong. Black is powerful, right? It is good to be black. You should be proud to be black. And what's this message of, well, can we come in and can we join you guys? No, not that. We don't want that. If white America doesn't want African Americans with them, well, fuck them, right? We're good on our own, right? Maybe they come, you can come join us. We're good over here, but we're going to do our own thing. We're going to collect together as the black nation. And in fact, another name for this is black nationalism. right? Having local governments run, if it's largely African American communities, having government communities run by African Americans, businesses run by African Americans taking care of themselves. Is in rejection. The whites are going to reject blacks. Well, then then African Americans reject white America just the same, right? And until white America wanted to come around and say, okay, just do your own thing. Probably the most famous voice of this is a man with a very interesting history. Some of y'all probably know a little bit of his backstory, and if you don't, there's a little bit of it in the textbook. It's definitely worth checking out. I am going to put a secondary video up to it. It's a 10-minute clip of a much longer speech. Please check it out. It's interesting, and if you like it, and you got an extra 40 minutes on your hand, listen to the rest of it. The speech is called "The Ballot or the Bullet," and the speaker is a guy named Malcolm X. If you want to look up a little bit about Malcolm X, read a little bit of his life on Wikipedia. He's a fascinating man. And some of y'all listen to that speech and you're like, I dig this. I understand where he's coming from. This is excellent. Some of you want to say, what is this? This guy racist? This guy is violent. He's exclusionary, and so all the walks in between. Regardless of what your views on Malcolm X are, you cannot take away from his perspective of how he saw America, right? And he certainly didn't see America in the same eye as Martin Luther King. He was very critical of Martin Luther King, especially early on in his career. Now, unfortunately for Malcolm X, we didn't get to see too much later on in his career, as he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam in 1965. And what would have come as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were trying to work together a little bit more, who knows? Of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated himself in '68. And we see the death of the two of the most prominent civil rights leaders. And that, in a whole, kind of encompasses the 60s, right? On one hand, you got a change of message. You have a real hardline push for civil rights. Right? And to go back on that change of message, something I left out. When you hear Malcolm X talk, he's not talking about turning the other cheek. If somebody hits you, you just accept it. He wasn't this pacifist, that Martin Luther King was. Malcolm X pretty clear. And if you actually will listen to the whole Ballot of the Bullet, he says, hey, if a dog bites you, a police dog bites you, you kill that dog. Somebody hits you, you hit them back twice as hard, right? Because it's not the African Americans that are the criminals here. It's not we that are protesting that are the criminals. The criminals are those people that refuse to, I can never get this right, they refuse to enforce the laws that are on the books. The criminals are the police. They are the governors, the politicians. A main point in that maybe if when you hear the speech, if you go on to the even further into it, he was criticizing voting for Democrats in the South, because the Democratic Party seemed to be the party of civil rights legislation. Right? It was the party of JFK and LBJ that seemed to promote civil rights legislation, and yet they didn't in his explanation, because the Democratic Party dominated the South. He called them the Dixiecrats. Well, the Dixiecrat was a Democrat. Anyways, worth checking out. Is it 100% necessary? Not at all. I'm not going to test you over it, but I think you might find it fascinating, especially if you're into civil rights at all. So, we have these two. The 60s, more violent, a different message, right? Moving forward. So, what's the legacy of the civil rights movement for African Americans? And it's always difficult to lecture on the civil rights movement, because at the end of a lecture, you want to end the lecture with a bang. You want to say, boom, and this is what happened. No, there is no bang. Civil rights movement, as we call it, an era in history, just kind of fizzled out, just kind of disappeared. It just kind of slowly died down. Now, do we have a modern civil rights movement awakening? Maybe. I don't know. I have my thoughts, but obviously I leave those thoughts to you, because that's what I want in your argumentative essay, right? Is the civil rights movement going to take on a much different tone? Are things like the internet going to change that? Are we closer together now because at the touch of our fingers we can see other cultures and other people and other lives, and maybe that brings togetherness? I don't know. These are thoughts nonetheless. But for the 50s and 60s in that civil rights movement, it doesn't go out with a bang, but a whimper as it kind of fizzles out. Although the African American civil rights movement is going to lead to participation in two other civil rights movements that we're going to talk about briefly, unfortunately, but nonetheless, at least bring up. And the first one we'll mention is the women's movement. If we think the women's movement, some women historians will say that today we're on seventh age feminism. We're in the seventh age of the feminist movement, the women's movement. For simplicity's sake, to not go all through that, let's just say this is the second stage. In many ways, the first women's movement that starts in the 1850s and with the Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention that you might remember from earlier chapters, or in 1301, depending on when you talk about, right? That kind of ended. The main part of the first women's movement was the right to vote. Well, in 1920, women were guaranteed the right to vote in the United States. And that kind of killed off the first age of the women's movement. But if you think about the women's movement today, is it really about the right to vote? It's not about political power. It's about, I mean, a lot of things go into it, economics, right? Perspective and culture. But really, when you get down to it, not just workplace, not just at the home, not just out in the streets. When you really break it down, it's just not being perceived as equal politically, but in society. And that's the kind of the framework of the modern women's movement, to be perceived as equal societally. Now, a lot of that has to do with economics, right? According to a 2015 study, so it's fairly recent data, women in the same jobs as men only make 82% of what men make, right? So there's still discrimination in pay. The idea, the concept of a glass ceiling is very much alive in corporate America and in the business world. If you're not sure what a glass ceiling is, it's this idea that, well, technically there are no regulations on how high somebody can rise in the company. In other words, the ceiling is glass, so you can see through it, right? Eventually you're going to rise up and you're going to hit your head on that ceiling and you're not going any further. It exists. It really does exist. And it's very hard to legislate. And so the women's movement is about to push for reform in society and culture to see that women are not considered as, second-class citizens and to be considered equals in all walks, right? And part of this, anyway, 2016, right, nearly came to fruition. We almost had our first woman's president. But let's go back. Where's all this coming from? Once again, it's easy to go back to World War II. And a lot of the drive for the women's movement happened as a lot of men were fighting overseas, women stayed home. And there was jobs that still needed to be done. You needed to build tanks and planes. You needed to build battleships, right? And so factory workers, a large part of the industrial labor force in the World War II was done by women, right? And World War II is going to go on a very long time. And here's the kind of thing, to kind of put it into an analogy for simplicity's sake. Many of you taking this class have a job. Maybe all of you have worked at some point in life, and if you haven't, that's okay. I think you still understand what we're talking about. Now, I love my job, right? And I do this don't tell my boss, but I do it for free. But maybe you hate your job. I don't know. Maybe you love your job as well. Regardless of whether you hate your job, or you're just okay. I know there's one day you like. There's one day everybody loves in their job, and that's payday, right? When you get that paycheck. When you think about that paycheck and what it really means. See, earning a paycheck is very liberating. If you go back to, say, when you were 12 years old and you wanted to do something, you wanted a soda from the store, who'd you have to ask? You had to say, Mom, Dad, can I have a soda? And they say, no, rot your teeth, it's bad for you. You can't have that, right? Or if, you wanted to go to the movies, right? And, you say, hey, Mom, Dad, I need some money to go to the movies with my friend, right? What are they going to do? They're going to ask you, who are you going with, right? What time does it start? What movie are you seeing? When are you going to be back? I don't like your friend Eric. You're not going to do that. And, they're going to just give you all that shit, right? What happens when you start working? Get the paycheck, and you see something at the store that you want, and you have the money for it. You don't have to ask anybody. That's your money. It's a very liberating experience, right? And what was happening in World War II, now this happened to some extent in World War I, but World War I was a shorter war. In World War II, you have women working 3.5 years. and making good money. They didn't want to go back home. And a lot of women, some did, but a lot of women didn't want to go back home. They liked that, right? Because if you went back home and you worked and you were just in the domestic sphere as a housewife, right? Who'd you have to ask? You want a new dress, right? You had to ask your husband. And, you know us guys, and you say, no, you got plenty of dresses. You look great. You wear the black one. You're fine, right? No. But you make money. You got money in your pocket. You pass by a store and you see a dress, you can buy it, right? And so we're going to see that the same thing in the African American civil rights movement. After World War II, there is this expectation. It's like, wait, why do I have to go back? During World War II, I did the exact same job you did. Why do I have to go back home now? I'm not good enough anymore? And so it would be this push, largely starting in the economic sphere. This is trying to expand to the social sphere. And one of the main core pushes of the women's movement was the passage of a constitutional amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. This amendment did not pass, right? It's going to fail it passes Congress, and when it goes to the states for 3/5 ratification, 3/5 of the states had to agree to it, it is going to fail in the states, right? I think, I'm sorry, I could be wrong on this. I think 27 out of the needed 30 states agreed to it, but it fails by 3 votes, 3 state votes. But the interesting thing of what killed the Equal Rights Amendment, right, is that it wasn't men and politicians that didn't want to give women equal rights. Because what the Equal Rights Amendment was calling for was, it basically said, the federal government cannot look at you differently based on gender, right? You are guaranteed the same thing based on gender. And at its core, it sounds like a great amendment. You're like, yeah, okay, fuck yeah. The government has to look as equal. Gender doesn't matter, But what killed the Equal Rights Amendment, strangely enough, was a woman. And a woman that was a feminist, that she wanted, she believed in the women's movement. And she said the Equal Rights Amendment would be the worst thing ever for women. She said, because if the government stops looking at gender differently, right, what about all those programs that are designed to aid and benefit women? They're going to go away, right? Single mothers can have more opportunity for government assistance than single fathers, right? When it gets into the military, and women in the military would have to do the exact same jobs, frontline combat soldiers, etc. And her point was that this would be bad. And so the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s was killed. Now, right or wrong, you might agree or disagree. And I am willing to bet that sometime in the course of your life, the Equal Rights Amendment is going to come up again. It's going to be proposed, and it's going to go through Congress. And it'll be very interesting this time around what happens with it. Because at its core, the Equal Rights Amendment does seem a very rational, reasonable thing. Yes, the government should not look at us differently based on gender. Well, what are the ramifications of that? Well, that's going to be the interesting debate. And the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of summarize it all, is what about the Hispanic movement, right? And once again, we have to go back to World War II and even before World War II. If you go back to prior to America's involvement in World War II, pretty much the only job available for somebody from Latin America, for Hispanic, in the United States, particularly in the Southern California and New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, was a picker. And as a picker, you would work in a big group, and you would go from farmer to farmer, from field to field, and you would pick the crops there. The orchards in California, the orange orchards in particular, strawberry fields, plum orchards, cotton fields, depending, particularly in eastern Texas, things like that. And the farmer would negotiate with your group, and they would pay you, and when that money was divided out, it was well below any semblance of a poverty line. It was dirt poor poverty. And these were called migrant workers, moved from field to field, from place to place, doing farm work, right? That was the only job until World War II happened. Then all of a sudden, with all the construction, the building in World War II, the United States needed anybody. We needed labor. And so a lot of Hispanics, particularly young men, started moving into cities like Los Angeles and getting jobs and getting good paying factory jobs, which were very good paying at that time, right? And this led to a lot of violence. If you're interested in this story, you might check out something called the Zoot Suit Riots, or if you've seen that movie American Me, the opening scene of that is the Zoot Suit Riots, as there was a clash here. But then after World War II, and we see as Latinos in the United States are saying, well, wait, African Americans and their civil rights movement, what about ours, right? And a term not used today, I mean, it was called the Chicano movement. Largely today, we just call it the Hispanic movement, or the Latino movement. So there's a push here, particularly for education reform, for government positions, right? In the same way that you had black nationalism in the African American movement, you see in Hispanic nationalism, La Raza Unida, and by the way, sorry for my Spanish pronunciations, I'm total gringo, but La Raza Unida, to come together in Hispanic communities. And then there was also a push for migrant worker reform, and I really couldn't talk about the Hispanic movement without talking kind of the quote, MLK of the Hispanic movement, a name that probably not well enough known in America, although some of y'all might have heard of him. His name was Cesar Chavez, right? And what he's going to do is he's going to push for, there's still a lot of Hispanics that were pickers, the same thing, of these migrant workers. Push for reform there, and basically had a great idea. He said they would always compete against each other, right? One migrant group would go up to a farmer and say, well, we'll pick your orange orchard for this much. Well, what about this other group? They'd come up and say, oh, they said this much, well, I'll do it for this much. And so they're competing each other and driving the prices down. So what did Chavez do? He unionized them, bring them together. He said, hey, come with your united front and say, okay, I'll pick it for this price. And that price was much higher than the farmers were used to paying. And so the farmers complained, and they complained to the local governments, right? And demanded, to break up this union. And the U.S. government and in California state government, in some sense, complied with this. They say, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Except they didn't count on Cesar Chavez, right? In his response, and he's going to lead boycotts and peaceful demonstrations, right? It's still impossible to get a good bottle of wine from 1973 because of the Great Boycott during that year. And these are going to be extraordinarily effective, right? And so we see, the main points, particularly the women's and Hispanic movement that I want to see, is when we look at the civil rights movement overall, yes, we're largely seem to be concerned with the African American movement just because it was the largest, it was the first, and it's what all these others are going to break off of. But it was not the only. Because we live in the United States. In the United States, there is an expectation of equality. And that was not being realized. And if it's not being realized, there has to be a push. And if the culture is not willing to accept it, then it needs to be a long, extended push that keeps going until there's reform. Until there is change, right? So what's the legacy of this? Was there change? Absolutely. Absolutely. The civil rights movement was extraordinarily effective in some things. We have bills and legislation. And and a culture in America has changed significantly from the 50s and 60s. Does that mean there's not a ways to go? Of course not. And in fact, you make a case that we have a very long ways to go, perhaps, right? Is the civil rights movement really over? Are we in a new one? What's going on? And when we look at things that happened in, say, Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, right? When we look at race issues today, Black Lives Matter and these, is this the start of a modern civil rights movement? Is this still like on the fringe of the old one that's continuing to live on? And what is it? Well, I leave these questions for you. And what do you think? What is the legacy of the civil rights movement? How far have things changed? How far do we need to go? Right? Et cetera, et cetera. There's 1,000 more. This video is already 40 minutes long. I could probably talk about this for another 4 hours, but I think that's good enough right there for today, guys. Have a great one, and I'll see you next time.